Leading up to the production of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, everyone's favorite Spider-Man film, Andrew Garfield spoke to producer Matt Tolmach about his ideas for where Spider-Man could go in the next film, plans he would later share with the press. In an interview with Entertainment Weekly, Garfield admitted that he half-jokingly suggested to Tolmach that The Amazing Spider-Man's version of Mary Jane, MJ, Mary Jane Watson, the woman who eventually Peter Parker would marry, should be changed to a guy. As Garfield put it, I was kind of joking, but kind of not joking about MJ. And I was like, what if MJ is a dude? Why can't we discover that Peter is exploring his sexuality? It's hardly even groundbreaking. So why can't he be gay? Why can't he be into boys? And look, I'm not going to try to assume anything about Andrew Garfield's motivations here. I do think that the fact that he had Michael B. Jordan in mind to play male MJ kind of shows he was wanted to share some romantic scenes with Michael B. Jordan, but, I mean, can you blame him? I mean, really? When Spider-Man's co-creator Stan Lee was asked at a convention about Andrew Garfield's statements, he responded with his usual theatrics and humor, but added,
Is he becoming bisexual? Spider-Man? Who have you been talking to? I don't know, seriously, I don't know anything about that. And if it's true, I'm going to make a couple of phone calls.
So why did Garfield want this? Well, he clarified that he sees Spider-Man as someone who stands in for anyone. That anyone can put on that mask and be Spider-Man. This is something that later Spider-Man films would also explore very thoroughly. Something that Stan Lee himself commented on throughout the character's history. That the brilliance of Spider-Man is his mask. It covers every inch of skin. Anyone can be anyone under that mask. And he represents New York City. I mean, yes, he's from Queens, but it's the New York City. He's the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. If you've been to New York City, you know it takes all kinds there. Everyone and anybody lives there. You can cross anyone's path. Anyone could be Spider-Man from any place. As Garfield explains, Spider-Man represents the everyman, but he represents the underdog and those marginalized who come up against great prejudice. Now, at this point in the film series, Peter Parker was already dating Gwen Stacy, making Garfield Spider-Man bi. And though MJ didn't appear in The Amazing Spider-Man 2 at all, though there was an actress cast, Shailene Woodley specifically, Peter does end up developing a close relationship with a boy, Harry Osborn. And that relationship involves the exchanging of fluids at some point. I mean, Harry really wants Peter inside of him.
I need to find him. I need his blood.
Now, I'd like to explain that in context that makes more sense, but actually in context, it makes somehow less sense than what I just said. But anyway, of course, what Garfield didn't know, or maybe didn't explain, was that Spider-Man legally could not be bisexual, at least on film. In one of the many documents that found its way to the public after the massive Sony leaks, we discovered a list of mandatory Spider-Man character traits. Basically, break these things and you're going to owe Marvel damages, financial damages. Spider-Man and Peter Parker had to have certain traits in order to qualify as Spider-Man. He couldn't torture. He won't kill unless it's out of self-defense. He won't sell drugs. He won't smoke cigarettes. But the last mandatory trait, Spider-Man is not a homosexual, unless Marvel has portrayed that alter ego as a homosexual. And while many of these traits are conditional and can be broken if Spider-Man wears the black symbiote suit, Spider-Man's sexuality is not one of those things that the symbiote can change. Penalty of breaking that? Legal damages to the Spider-Man brand, legal damages to Marvel Comics, and thus now the Disney Corporation. This means you cannot make Spider-Man a homosexual unless Marvel Comics creates a version of Spider-Man that is also homosexual. Now, you might be thinking, well, that doesn't count bisexuality. That means Andrew's in the clear, right? Well, hold on to that for a second, because then there's the traits of Peter Parker. He has to be Caucasian, he has to be male, and he has to be heterosexual. On one hand, someone can say, well, it makes sense. You know, there's numerous female love interests for Spider-Man in the comics, and if you make him gay, that cuts off the potential for those characters. Gwen Stacy, Mary Jane, Felicia Hardy, yes, of course. But if you change Spider-Man's sexuality, that would force Sony to diverge further from the comics, and thus muddy the recognition of the brand. Marvel Comics can do that, but not Sony. They're a third party. Very famously, there were fan campaigns to have Donald Glover play Spider-Man after Tobey Maguire left the role. This is before Andrew Garfield was officially cast. It was a massive fan campaign, gigantic. I think it's very interesting how, after this campaign, Marvel Comics brought in Miles Morales, someone to inherit the role of Ultimate Spider-Man after Ultimate Peter Parker was slain in a battle. Miles Morales, a biracial, black and Latino Spider-Man, who in essence seemed to break every single rule Marvel had forced Sony to obey. And it's no surprise that Sony would then later jump at the chance to feature Miles Morales in their animated Spider-Verse films, where the theme of the film is, anyone can be Spider-Man.
Anyone can wear the mask. You could wear the mask.
So maybe the mainstream Peter Parker can't be gay, but there are other Spider people who are gay, right? Or bi, or trans. Well, that's a question I raised back in, 2019. Seriously, 5 years ago. Oh God, how long have I been on the internet for? That is ridiculous. Anyway, this is back when I contributed to CBR regularly, a website that I could probably do an entire video about at some point to discuss their process, but I'll hold back on that for now. I brought up that same question, coming to a similar conclusion. Why couldn't there be a queer Spider-Man character in the Spider-Verse? In the expansive universe of different alternate Spider-Man, why do all of them have to be heterosexual? And since that article was written, there have been multiple queer Spider-Men. First, there was Cooper Cohen, known as the Webweaver. Cooper hails from Earth 71490, and in this universe, he's a boy who grew up alongside Peter Parker, harboring a hidden crush on Peter. And he saves Peter from the radioactive spider when it gets irradiated. And he ultimately gains the powers of the Spider-Man himself. Now, there's a couple of things here that I think are very interesting. For one, Cohen and Parker do end up going on a date. Kinda. Cohen gets stood up at a date, Peter bumps into him, and they have a bro date. You know, a bromance, if you were. And then afterwards, they go to college. Cohen goes to fashion school. Peter Parker goes to Empire State. And they become roommates. You see, they were roommates.
Oh my God, they were roommates.
Now, Cohen does lean a little too heavily into some queer stereotypes. He's a runway model photographer. He studies fashion. He dresses like, well, you see what he dresses like. And that's not bad inherently. Queer people can express their queerness however they want. But it's interesting that the first Spider-Man is so flamboyant, which some can say is problematic. I personally do not. I'm just bringing it up because it's worth discussing. I see no problem with this personally, especially considering Cohen is not the only gay Spider-Man, or rather, Spider-Person. There's the Sun Spider, Charlotte Weber from Earth 223. Charlotte Weber, Charlotte's Web, you get it? You get the puns? You get the jokes here? Okay. Charlotte was bitten by a radioactive spider. I know, shocking. But what makes her interesting is that she has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or EDS. She uses a wheelchair as a civilian, but she uses crutches while jumping from web to web and wall crawling and fighting crime. She has extreme flexibility, which gives her a special ability. Now, she's also queer. She's either a lesbian or bisexual. It's not really established, though she does have like a gay flag blanket on her legs in a wheelchair, so I assume that means she's probably a lesbian, but I digress. But one more thing I think is interesting about Sun Spider. She's the only queer Spider-Person to show up in film. In fact, she appeared just recently in Across the Spider-Verse.
I'm a huge fan of your work.
Thanks.
Do you think spider people too often use comedy as crutch? Get it? Crutch?
So we have a gay Spider-Person in a movie now. Granted, the film doesn't explicitly showcase her sexuality, but hey, that's still something incredible. So ultimately, in the years following my article, everything I asked for happened. And in a way where you probably didn't even notice it happened at all. If you're an average fan of Spider-Man, you probably don't know about any of these characters. So it begs the question why people thought I was being so unreasonable for making this statement when it's happened and you don't even notice.
Peter Parker isn't gay. There's 60 plus years of comics proving this. Stop ruining characters by playing politics.
Multiple videos, Reddit threads, one after the other, going on about how somehow this was the worst idea in the world. Spider-Man has always been straight. Spider-Man has always been a man. Spider-Man has always been white.
You said, quote, "Beyond homophobia, is there any good reason why Spider-Man can't be any sexual orientation other than straight?" Yes, because he's got over 60 years of history banging women.
So, when we break away from that, why doesn't the world end? Well, simply put, anyone can be under the mask. The problem with bisexuality as a perceived idea, the word specifically, is that people seem to believe that a person coming out as bisexual is in some way negating everything that came before.
You try to weasel around this by saying some gay people come out later in life, but you've got a problem. There's this comic book convention that lets us know the inner secrets of a character's mind called thought balloons and captions. And for 6 decades, hundreds of writers wrote Peter as attracted to men, but conveniently left it out of all, literally hundreds of thousands of his inner monologues. All of them. That makes no sense.
How can Spider-Man be bisexual if he's never thought about wanting a guy before? When discussions like this come up, there are often 2 responses. People either go back and look for potential queerness as evidence, or present the following fact, which I will do right now, and then do the first thing I mentioned. A queer person can be queer even if they don't realize it. Yes, you have thought bubbles, but if you're not aware of your thought processes, then you're not going to consciously think about, oh, I'm so bisexual, I'm so closeted. No, you're going to think, oh, okay, that's interesting. You may feel feelings that don't make sense to you, that push you to act in a certain way, despite the fact you don't understand why you're acting that way. Some people are so deeply repressed, they overlook signs of queer identity until later on in life. Even their 20s, their 30s, hell, even later. I think it's interesting how people reacted this way when Iceman came out, that he had repressed his sexuality so deeply that it took bringing a child version of him back from the past and kind of forcing him to come to his own senses about his sexuality before the adult version of Iceman also came to realize or admit publicly his feelings. But that's suppression. That's not quite the same thing as repression. Suppression means you're aware of it and you kind of bottle it inside. You're so deep in the closet you don't even admit to yourself about it. You try to force yourself to be straight. Whereas repression sometimes means you're not even aware of it because you're not registering the feelings that you feel as what they are. That's a real thing, a common thing with a lot of queer people who grow up, especially those who grew up in conservative households. And while I'm not saying that Spider-Man is necessarily a conservative character, you know, his aunt and uncle aren't exactly on the front lines of, women's liberation marches back in the, well, maybe Aunt May was, but I digress. So, Peter Parker's had some very close male friendships. He spends more time around Harry Osborn in the Raimi films than his love interest Mary Jane. The relationship between Johnny Storm and Peter in the comics is that of vitriolic best buddies, but some fans have read a little more into that. We'll get to that in a second. And then, of course, there's that one time that Peter Parker and Eddie Brock stripped their shirts off to seduce the Venom symbiote. This is the thing that happened. We'll also get to that later. Just put that in your memory hole for now for a bit. We'll get back to it. But first, Johnny Storm. Let's look at that for a second. Let's look at when they first met. In Amazing Spider-Man #1, the first issue of Spider-Man's ongoing solo series, they hit it off as rivals initially. They don't see eye to eye at all. In fact, they can't stand each other. But over those first few dozen issues, things change. It's thanks to the Human Torch, for example, that Spider-Man gains the confidence to fight Doc Ock after their first encounter, where Spidey loses. To say that they never give up, they always keep fighting. That inspires Spidey, inspires him to grow, inspires him to overcome this major obstacle in his way. Johnny and Peter have this special spot over by the Statue of Liberty where they'll hang out, chat, talk, tease each other. Oh, and during the Hickman Fantastic Four run, they become roommates.
Oh my god, they were roommates.
And then he's there to support Franklin Richards when Johnny dies for a bit. They're extremely close. And keep in mind, at the beginning of the comics, Johnny was the closest thing that Peter could call a friend or have any real relationship with outside of his aunt and uncle. Or his dead uncle, I should say. Like, don't forget, the only love interest at this time was Betty Brant, a character who he has no chemistry with, who rejects Spider-Man outright after a series of events, and quite frankly is so minor in the hierarchy of love interests that even when she was adapted in the Raimi film, they still didn't even entertain her as a possible love interest for Spider-Man.
Miss Brandt? That's not the position I hired you for.
I think the only version of Spider-Man uses Betty Brant's love interest is the 60s cartoon, which is odd considering Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane were introduced before the 60s cartoon came out. And while Mary Jane shows up, Gwen Stacy doesn't. I just think it's very interesting in hindsight. But ultimately, bisexuality as an identity is a little different than being gay or straight. It exists as a spectrum. Some people are more bi for men than they are for women, or they like same genders as opposed to different genders, etc., etc. It's very interesting how that works out. Now, let's talk about Deadpool for a second here as well. You'll see where I'm coming from with this. Deadpool, very early on, was presented as a very secretive assassin. The only person he had any feelings for was Vanessa Carlyle, aka the mutant copycat, or Vanessa from the Deadpool films, if you've only seen those. However, after that storyline ran its course, a lot of different people fell for Deadpool, and Deadpool fell for them. A couple examples right here. Domino, Carol Danvers, Rogue, Santana Hellstrom, the daughter of Satan himself, Big Bertha from the Great Lakes Avengers, the alien tow trucker Orska, yes, this is a thing, Hillary Clinton, yes, and Death, the very entity that Thanos pines for. But he's also been attracted to Thor Odinson, Captain America, Wolverine, Colossus, and yes, most relevant to here, Spider-Man. On AO3, the most popular ship involving Wade Wilson is not Vanessa, it's not Carol Danvers, it's not Rogue, it's Peter Parker. And so, while we can't take AO3 as a greater representation of the whole fandom, that proves that a lot of people think that Deadpool and Spider-Man make a good couple. Right? Well, are they gay for each other? Well, no, because neither Deadpool or Spider-Man are gay. First off, Deadpool is pansexual, which is distinctly different from bisexuality. Bisexuality is the attraction to genders like and unlike the self. Pansexuality is attraction regardless of gender. These might seem very similar in nature, but these labels are very meaningful to the individuals who accept them. And the distinction between bisexuality and pansexuality are very similar, but not quite, being bi and pan, they're close, but not quite the same thing, and the differences are important to those individuals. Just respect that, Cool. The second thing is that many of Deadpool's crushes are one-sided. Almost all the names I mentioned before, they don't feel the same way about Deadpool the way Deadpool feels about them. And that includes Spider-Man, who is often put off by Deadpool's advances. So, does that mean Spider-Man can't be bi? Well, no. It just means Spider-Man doesn't feel that way about Deadpool. Except for the fact that they grow old together and they have special relationships and they fill each other's holes, as Deadpool puts it. See, this is the problem when discussing any bi discourse, because with fictional characters, because people want to see bisexuality being performed for them at all angles, even though that's not how bi people work. A bi person won't just have a boyfriend and a girlfriend at the same time. I mean, they could, but that's not a requirement. Nor are they going to get flustered around every single person. I mean, I get flustered around everyone, but that's beside the point. That's not relevant, But I'm saying is that they have preferences, and some people may like one gender more than the other in that way, and that's fine. A character like Black Cat comes to mind. She is canonically bi, yet her bi-ness rarely ever comes into play. Very famously, she has a girlfriend in Insomniac's Spider-Man 2.
Look, kid. Not that it's your business. My girlfriend's in Paris. And I got her into trouble with some bad people.
And there's some intimacy in the comics, but it's sparing. Sure, she may flirt with Mary Jane a little bit by talking about how her butt fits into that suit, but that's not really reflective of even explicit bi-ness. It kind of erases her identity because it never comes up. But then again, does it need to come up? Bi erasure in fiction is a very complicated topic because bi people shouldn't have to perform for an audience. They shouldn't have to demonstrate how bisexual they are at every second. That doesn't make them any less valid as a bisexual. But at the same time, if you ignore in fiction their bi identity, what ends up happening is audiences forget that they're bi, which means they have to come out multiple times to the public. And case in point for that, fairly recently as of recording of this video, is Kitty Pryde. In Exceptional X-Men #1, Kitty Pryde came out as bi. But it's kind of odd, because I recall Kitty Pryde coming out years earlier, back in Marauders number 12, which was 4 years before this coming out. Because, yeah, she did come out as bi then, and now she's coming out as bi again. Because people forgot. Because it comes up so rarely in the comics explicitly that mainstream audiences forget. And so websites can make these big declarations like, oh, this character just came out. And people go, oh, I can't believe they made Kitty Pryde bisexual, even though Chris Claremont has clarified that when he was writing Excalibur and all the X-Men comics he was writing, his end goal was always to get Kitty Pryde with Rachel Summers. Look, there's several issues of Excalibur and the various X-Men comics where Kitty Pryde's either really close to Rachel Summers or Magic, Colossus' sister, who Kitty Pryde also had a relationship with Colossus, but that's neither here nor there. And this was reoccurring. Multiple writers continued this thread, but also multiple writers didn't pick up on this thread. You get the whiplash. Bi readers in one issue might pick up on Magic and Kitty on a bed together, kind of in a position where it looks like they were just cuddling. But then they'll get Kitty Pryde being resentful of all the women around her. So you get whiplash. What's going on here? It depends on the writer, ultimately. I also think it's interesting how Kitty Pryde was played by Elliot Page prior to him coming out as a trans man. It's interesting because I feel like Kitty Pryde has always been associated with queerness, either directly or indirectly, that was in many ways repressed or private in some way. Now, with this greater context, of course, things come together. They make more sense, but that's years and years of suppressed queer identity in media. I feel one of the most overt examples of fans figuring out a character's sexuality years before they come out as bi, or maybe even the writers realize that they're bi, is Tim Drake's Robin.
They just suddenly went, oh, hey, Tim, fancy some cock?
Though the way Tim Drake came out as bi, I think, is interesting. Robin has always been associated with queerness in camp since the beginning. I mean, since Seduction of the Innocent, DC has been trying to make sure that you understand that Robin's not gay. Robin's really not gay. He's not going to turn the kids gay like Seduction of the Innocent implied. They even gave Robin extra girlfriends just to make sure he wasn't gay. For real, he's not gay. Even though Dick Grayson is the most bisexual-coded straight man this side of Bloodhaven, he's not gay. I promise. And Jason Todd, not gay either. But Tim Drake, even when they tried to make sure he was as straight as possible, kept coming across as bi, or at least queer in some way. Now, particularly a lot of fans read into his relationship with Connor Kent. The two have a lot of chemistry while on teams together, fighting alongside one another. While on the page is canonically friendship, some fans read into it a little further. And again, I want to repeat, some fans, not all, read their interactions as possibly queer-coded. With the context of Tim Drake coming out, however, those scenes play a little differently. They read differently with the added context. It was not intended that was going to be the end game when those scenes were written, but it does impact how you reflect and revisit those scenes, should you go back to those old comics. And there are other scenes too that I think feed into this. So
you're still trying to get Tim Drake over as bi, even though everyone knows he likes fish with his chips because we've read his thoughts for nearly 3 decades. And in the middle of doing this, you step on that story to have not Superman become a phallic unicorn too.
In Robin number 40, there's a scene where Tim Drake, he's dating a girl named Ariana at the time. It's like a love triangle between him and Stephanie Brown, who he would later go out with. And Ariana wants to take things to the bedroom, but Tim declines. He doesn't feel ready for intimacy yet. And there's some honest pain in Ariana's eyes when this happens. She's embarrassed, insecure in herself, but some readers who are queer might project some of their own life experience into this, where they might have been with someone of a orientation or sexuality or gender that they weren't attracted to, and they had to back away. A lot of readers responded very strongly to this scene for that reason. And though Tim Drake ends up being with Stephanie Brown instead of Ariana, the comics indicate he feels unfulfilled and depressed even. And this reads a little queer if you ask me too. Like, look, listen, it's not intentional. I'm sure they were doing something else with that, like trying to say, oh, maybe he'll end up with Ariana later on or whatever. But like, it reads as not straight, okay? And like, look at how Tim Drake talks to Connor Kent. All right, this is the kind of chemistry that you would expect in a romantic situation, and that's with his teammate and not, I suppose, his girlfriends. Now, the real betrayal, in my opinion, was that Tim ends up with Bernard and not Connor. Who the fuck is Bernard? Now, the Wayne Family Adventures on Webtoons does explore Tim Drake's relationship with Bernard better than the mainstream comics, I think. Because in the mainstream comics, Bernard is just Tim Drake's boyfriend. And they're cute, and they're happy. But there's not really an exploration of the dynamics, of the navigation of boundaries. Most stories where Bernard features, it's centered on Tim Drake, and Bernard's like an accessory to Tim Drake. Even one of the most noteworthy stories about Bernard focuses on Tim Drake talking to Stephanie Brown, his ex-girlfriend, about him being bi. But Bernard barely features into the story, where Bernard's a central figure of it. Bernard's an accessory, but Connor was always there for Tim Drake. He was always alongside him in some fashion, and there was some tension, and there was tragedy, and there was mourning, and there was desperation. Bernard's just kind of there, and there's not really much of a history. I know Bernard's an older character, sure, but there's not that same history he has with other people. Even the writing with Ariana feels more charged than with Bernard, and that's an ex-girlfriend who he did not sleep with. And look, it's not just me, okay? I'm not just the one saying Tim Drake and Connor can have chemistry. On AO3, which I repeat again is not reflective of the entire fandom, Tim Drake and Connor Kent have 5,903 fics written about them. Now granted, the most popular Batman ship is Dick Grayson and Jason Todd, the straightest of straight Robins at all. Why are you asking questions? Harley fans, her fics are elsewhere. But that's still more than most of the other Batman fan fictions on the site, in terms of shipping. The majority of these bisexual characters we see in certain trends, right? Either they come out as bisexual for a singular relationship, and it never comes up again, or we see these characters enter into a relationship that seems to lack chemistry in it. With Tim Drake and Bernard, the dynamic is far less interesting in the mainstream comics because Bernard isn't allowed to be his own character. He's not allowed to have his wants and needs. He's an extension of Tim Drake's exploration and identity, but not really his own character who has an arc alongside it. And that's a failure of the comics because every other one of Tim Drake's love interests, especially Stephanie Brown, were allowed to be their own characters. Even in the Wayne Family Adventures, which I celebrated before, Bernard's an accessory in that story too, because it focuses on Tim Drake's anxieties and him going to cool lesbian aunt Batwoman, Kate Kane, for advice. Even with Deadpool and Kitty Pryde, their same gender relationships are not given the same focus as their opposite gender ones are, especially among fans. Kitty has great chemistry with Magic and Rachel Summers, but there's never an official culmination with their relationships. It's always subtext. As for Deadpool, he has a lot of men he's attracted to, but they're never treated as seriously in either the comics or among the fans and websites and listicles you always take a look at. I was doing a lot of reading on this list to make sure I figured out every one of Deadpool's people he's attracted to. I went down the list, and I found a bunch of websites where they ranked all of Deadpool's canonical love interests. This article right here I'm going to show you right now, this article had 20 women and 0 men. Unless you count Death as a beyond gender entity, so in which case 19 women and Death. But it was updated with the release of Deadpool and Wolverine. And even in the Deadpool films, Deadpool flirts with Colossus, he flirts with Wolverine quite a bit. The marketing for Deadpool and Wolverine, they used romance as a joke for Deadpool's relationship with Wolverine, creating several runners-up for the most homoerotic image involving Wolverine, though never beating this one. This still takes the cake. They said they didn't know what they were doing with this one, but they were cooking very well. I don't want to call out this article in particular. I don't want to attack the writer. I don't want to do any of that because it's not about them specifically. It's about the greater conversation of bi identity in media. When Deadpool is attracted to a woman, it's a serious relationship. The fans and the websites and Marvel acknowledges it as a serious relationship. If he's attracted to a guy, it's a gag. Even Spider-Man, where he had an ongoing series with, where the whole thing was their chemistry, with several allusions being made to them filling each other's empty slots, building their characters up, showcasing that they are growing and maturing as a result of this relationship, even that is still treated as a gag, even in the context of the writing, even as we saw the very real impact of these connections. Even though Deadpool has Spider-Man on the list of people he wants to smash, websites do not acknowledge it as serious, and thus because the conversations around the media don't take it seriously, people do not take it seriously. It is not canon, even though it basically is canonical attraction, because we are not discussing it as though it is. Spider-Man is allowed to inch up to the line with so many male characters. Johnny Storm, Harry Osborn, Deadpool. But they never say the words. They never say the words that there's some hint there. They don't pull a Kitty Pryde Magic or a Kitty Pryde and Rachel Summers. They don't pull a Tim Drake and Connor Kent. It's just up to the line.
If Peter was meant to represent the underdog, maybe he should. Actually should. Wouldn't it be nice if LGBTQ plus people had a mainstream character to look up to? Marvel doesn't want it getting out their prized possession as secretly bisexual. Imagine all the angry dude bros who would complain about their interests not being catered to for once. Who cares anyway? Peter Parker's just a glorified furry.
And the same thing cannot be said with Venom.
You know, it would be nice just to have your support. Just for once.
Catch up!
Venom is one of Spider-Man's most iconic adversaries, and arguably the only one who's successful had an independent trilogy of films. I say debatably because the films have a lot of problems, but I love them. I love them all. And throughout the trilogy, they play Eddie and the symbiote's relationship as a couple. It's symbiosis, but it means there's a relationship dynamic. They get into arguments with each other. They're basically roommates, but closer.
Oh my god, they were roommates.
In other words, a married couple. And the films are not subtle about this at all. Now, remember a while ago in this video, near the beginning in fact, I mentioned that Peter Parker and Eddie one time fought over the Venom symbiote by taking their clothes off and trying to seduce the symbiote. They were rolling nat 20s on the seduction. So I guess they turned into bards in that case. Well, the symbiote is an agender alien entity who merges with its host. The symbiote and Eddie retain enough of their individuality to form a partnership, a union, one that doesn't involve eclipsing the other, as is the case with Carnage, where they both merge into one entity. Also, Venom has multiple children together with Eddie. Not just Carnage, Scream, and the rest, but also Dylan, who is essentially the child of Venom, Eddie, and Eddie's ex-wife, Anne Weying, who became the host of the symbiote back in the 90s. The symbiote passed from Eddie into Anne, and when it went to Anne, it went everywhere, and, baby. So yeah, merging with the symbiote can result in intercourse. So when Peter tries to seduce the symbiote off of Eddie, and the symbiote is bound both to Eddie and to Peter, and they're both shirtless on a beach, I'm just saying, there's nothing heterosexual about it. But what does this have to do with bisexuality? Well, look, this just shows that Peter was willing to have an intimate relationship with an alien entity. One that was neither male or female, strictly speaking. Forming a partnership. One that can be erotic in nature. The films and the comics recontextualize the relationship between the symbiote and host as a union comparable to a romance, rather than a parasite who dresses as a costume. It's not some parasite, it's a lover without gender. Sounds pretty queer to me. So, what though? What am I saying Spider-Man should become? Should he be bi in the comics? Should he run around with a bisexual flag instead of webbing between his armpits? Well, no. I think that'd be very silly, personally. A version of the Spider-Man character who's not straight, we've gotten that. More would be nice, but hey, 2 out of the 9,000 that exist, that's cool, I guess. I mean, how many different versions of Spider-Man are just a bunch of spiders dressed up as people? There's the 1,000. There's Spiders Man. That's 2. So we get just as many versions of a queer Spider-Man as we get versions of a coalition of spiders dressed up as a Spider-Man. That's fair, right? That's how it should work? Well, no. What I'm saying is a little more nuanced, we'll say. Spider-Man should be allowed in media if they allow it to be not straight. Wolverine, for example, had that. Wolverine in one alternate continuity, he became the president of Canada, and with his adamantium claws forged with nth metal or whatever, he becomes in a relationship with Hercules, a romantic one, very explicitly. They are alternate versions of these characters who are not straight. Very famously, Tony Stark and Captain America are either rivals in every continuity or lovers in some continuities. Yes, there's the version where Tony Stark is a woman, but I digress. The point of the matter is that it's strange to me how Marvel legally wrote down that Spider-Man's heterosexuality was a core defining trait of his character, that they were so afraid of this changing, of this affecting how the public saw Spider-Man, that his straightness was seen as a defining characteristic. I find it strange because it doesn't make any sense. Spider-Man's core appeal has always been anyone can be under that mask. He's the everyman, dealing with everyday problems. He may have an ingrown toenail. He might get acne one day. He might break a rib and have to keep on fighting.
We tried to make our characters have feet of clay. Now, poor Spider-Man. I mean, okay, he's pretty good at catching bad guys, but he's apt to get an allergy attack while he's fighting. He worries about dandruff. He'll have an ingrown toenail, tears his costume. His Aunt May won't let him go out to save the world because he's not wearing his galoshes and it's snowing out.
So why would sexual orientation be somehow this unusual thing?
After 20 years of writing pap and writing things like the strips you mentioned before, I suddenly realized, gee, I can actually have fun with what I'm doing. And now, the more realistic we make our characters, the more the college kids who read them think that it's satire, which has taught me a very great lesson. The world is so crazy that if you present things the way they really are, it comes across as broad satire.
Marvel Comics always presented itself as the world outside your window, but by making it so that Peter Parker can never express any attraction to men, this kind of defeats the purpose. Or, what I think is more likely, Marvel Comics never considered bisexuality an option. You see, the thing is, for a very long time, people believed you were either gay or you were straight. There's a very famous magazine cover from Time where they introduce the bisexual, the new concept of the 90s. You know, something ridiculous like that, as though bi people had not existed beforehand. As though orientation as understood in the 20th century was the norm for centuries, if not thousands of years into the past. That is not the case. Because homosexuality and heterosexuality were the only two options, the idea of a bi-Peter never even occurred to anyone. And you know what? I don't know how I feel about that. Because that's not a reflection of Peter Parker specifically. Peter Parker, who cares? You know, Spider-Man, I love the character. You know, how he is, great. Different writers tackle him, great. I'd rather his marriage to Mary Jane get restored. I can't believe that's still a problem. But again, there's worse things in Spider-Man comics than Spider-Man not being able to kiss Johnny Storm. That's not really a big issue I have. Nor do I want to make it sound like I want to campaign for a bisexual Spider-Man. Though I am also doing that. Let's have an alternate version of Spider-Man that's bi in the comics. No, what I'm actually really upset by with all of this is the idea that bisexuality was so unimportant, it was never even considered an option. There's either the gay switch or the straight switch, and there's no medium setting there. There's no slider. It is very discouraging, because even when characters are presented as possibly not heterosexual or homosexual, things get very messy. Take a look at Loki. In the Loki series, they teased that Loki might be bisexual or pansexual, like he is in the comics.
Must have been would-be princesses? Or perhaps another prince?
A bit of both. I suspect the same as you.
And they kind of verbally teased it, but they never gave any explicit demonstration of that orientation in the show. Unless you read into his relationship with Mobius, but I don't, so we're not. The problem is this. It's not even an option. They don't care. They have no consideration that it's even an option. So why should we as fans ask for it? We know we're not going to get it. But alternatively, when they do give the random character no one cares about a different orientation, people go mental over it.
Oh man, stuff is getting funnier and funnier. So, Superman is now bisexual. So
Ethan Van Sciver was right. DC Comics made John Kent, son of Superman and Lois, a phallic unicorn. Ethan predicted this months ago, but it's not like we couldn't see this coming. DC has gone the route of 2017 Marvel Comics, trying every woke angle imaginable to boost social media attention while rarely boosting sales.
And look how that kind of messes up their mind. Studies show that kids that experience trauma and stuff, it affects them later on. So if they're growing up and they're seeing, lesbians and gays on Disney Plus, they're already conditioning themselves that, hey, I want to suck dick.
Again, there's so much outrage that happened when John Kent, Clark Kent's son, came out as bi. This was a new original character, someone who was created only a few years prior. They constantly say, make your own characters and make them not straight. Well, okay, here's just that. Here is a new character who happens to be bi. But because he's his father's son, you got Dean Cain on Fox News complaining about it.
They said it's bold and it's and a bold new direction. I say they're bandwagoning. A Robin of Batman, and Robin, as you mentioned, just came out as bi or gay recently. And there's real evil in this world today, real corruption and government overreach, plenty of things to fight against, human trafficking.
You got people making these long 50-minute videos complaining that, there's a Superman that's not straight. And by not straight, I mean bi. And by bi, I mean his first relationship with anyone in the canon of the text is with a boy. Because here's the thing. It's not about whether or not this character has come out as bi or is bi. It's not about the history of the character, no matter how much people paint it as that. And people will respond to this saying, oh, well, Spider-Man's been straight for 60 years. And yeah, okay, well, that doesn't affect the Spider-Verse, but sure, go off, King, have fun with that. Point is this. It doesn't really matter because when they reacted to John Kent that way, they kind of overplayed their hand. They showed, hey, we don't actually care about original characters. We don't actually care about any of that. We're just going to react with anger no matter what happens. Look at Morph, a character whose whole ability is shapeshifting. Morph was confirmed as non-binary in X-Men 97, and certain subsections of the internet flipped out.
And they put a bunch of subversive agenda stuff in it that just got glossed over after the show came out because people are desperate at this point to recapture what we had back in the 90s, back in the 80s when Marvel and Star Wars were actually cool things, and Star Trek too. But all these things are dead now. They are just skin suits of what they were before. These allegories are here for the story, and I'm not one of those people who's like, it's okay, as long as it subtly hates me, I'm going to keep watching it. I see these things and I'm like, screw this.
Morph. Because the shapeshifter was the most cisgendered person in the X-Men. A character who multiple times transformed into women. A character who transformed into Rogue to seduce Gambit. Whose only friend was Wolverine. Who had many intimate scenes where they were pining after each other. In the original 90s series, not even like 97. That was the straight heterosexual guy. That was the cisgendered guy, right? That was the one? Yeah. So they don't really care. It's not really a concern to them. It's never been a concern to them. So my opinion is, why bother erasing it for their sake? Because they're going to complain no matter what. Make it more bi. As long as you make the characters who they're attracted to actual characters with arcs, and their relationships are taken seriously, just as seriously as any heterosexual relationship is. So my pitch is not simply to say, hey, make Spider-Man more bisexual. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying make your bi characters more visibly bi. Because Bi Erasure services no one. You can put Tim Drake is bi or Kitty Pryde is bi on a news headline, but that's not quite the same thing as showcasing what it means to live as a bi person. Because a bi relationship, no matter if you're with the same or opposite gender, you are always impacted by that orientation. And if I can be serious for a second, bisexual people are subject to more violence than any other demographic out there. They are more susceptible to domestic abuse, to any of that from their partners who discount their orientation. These are statistics that are very important and sobering to look at, because it's not just simply, oh, you just want to be with everyone, you want to just fetishize people. No, that's not it at all. No. What it is a declaration that the impact of sexual orientation and what it has on relationship dynamics and potential abuse. Fiction is a great gateway to explaining what it means to be bi. It's not that you want a lot of things, you're greedy, you're hoarding. No, it just means you're attracted to people like anyone else. It just, you're attracted to different traits. It's that simple, but people act like it's some big thing. That you have to change your outlook on life because you find you're attracted to more than just one group of people sometimes. It's amazing how people have to jump through hoops to justify their orientation, and even after jumping through those hoops, they are still discredited and they are still hurt by the masses. And that's a serious topic that requires a lot more discussion than just me talking about bi Spider-Man as a joke.
Think of how much of an insensitive, narcissistic, self-righteous, privileged asshole you have to be to think white people don't know what it's like to be different. As if every white dude is accepted without question. There's no bullying in the white community. Every white guy just lives this awesome, trouble-free life. On behalf of the 12% of my ancestors who were white, fuck you. Wait, on second thought, you might actually enjoy that. No, I still mean it. Fuck you.
And the fact that vitriol was the first response to so much of this back in the day, it tells me something. That people won't listen. They'll see the beginning lines and stop there and close off. They won't listen to the pitch, they won't listen to anything else, and they'll call me a fetishist for continuing. I digress.
Because, these people do hate you. If you look at Bo DeMeo, the guy who's the showrunner for the show, he is a person who just really, really wants to tear down this society, put his global homo agenda into everything, and then you better eat it up, consumer, or you're a bigot. That's what these people act like. It was a big DEI thing all the way through.